Welcome to one of the most horrible cases ever recorded in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is when you're listening to this. We want to know where these documented accounts go and when they do. It was the year 1901. It was the beginning of spring in Shannon County, Missouri, which is in the middle of the Ozarks. After a very cold winter, the hills were starting to turn green. The small town of Eminence, which is the county seat and has only about 500 residents, was getting ready for what they hoped would be a good season. It was then that Reverend Thomas Whitley first noticed something strange about the Caldwell property, which is about 7 miles northeast of town, just past Jack's Fork River. There was a small, unnamed lake next to the Caldwell homestead that wasn't shown on any county maps. The Reverend had been visiting farms on the outskirts of town to check on his parishioners after a tough winter. When he passed the Caldwell land, which he rarely visited, he noticed what he called an unusual stillness that seemed to go beyond the natural quiet of the countryside. County records show that the Caldwell family moved to the area around 1878. Joseph Caldwell, his wife Margaret, and their 4 children had come from Pennsylvania, but they didn't say why they had chosen such a remote place to live. Most people in the area thought the land they built their house on was worthless because it had rocky soil and a body of water that didn't move and looked dark even on the brightest days. Records from the county assessor in 1879 show that Joseph Caldwell paid the full asking price for the property without negotiating. This was a strange choice that raised eyebrows at the time. Reverend Whitley, who had been serving the community since 1871 and kept the parish records for the area, wrote in his personal journal that the Caldwells had never asked him to perform any of the baptisms, marriages, or burials he had done for other families in the area. They mostly stayed to themselves and only went into town when they had to. When they did, they didn't say much, got their business done quickly, and went back to their property before nightfall. Joseph Caldwell's insistence on paying for everything with gold coins from strange places was the most interesting thing. Thomas Ledbetter, the owner of the general store, wrote down that the coins had markings that looked like they came from the old country. People in town didn't see the Caldwell kids very often. Elizabeth, the oldest, sometimes went with her father to buy things. People sometimes saw Robert helping to load the wagon. People in town didn't really know the younger ones, Sarah and David. Joseph Caldwell told the county administrator that he personally taught them, so none of them went to the local school. No one thought this was strange, which was normal for remote homesteads in the area at the time. In early April 1901, Margaret Caldwell got sick all of a sudden, which drew the attention of the whole community to the Caldwell family. It was unusual for Dr. William Harrington to be called to the property, which caused a lot of talk in Eminence. His medical log from the 7th of April 1901 says that he found a household that was in a state of disarray that was worrying. The patient shows signs of severe anemia and possible arsenic exposure, but the source is still not clear. The doctor's handwriting, which is usually very neat, looked rushed or upset in this entry. Dr. Harrington's notes, which were kept in the Shannon County Historical Society's archives until they mysteriously disappeared during a courthouse renovation in 1962, said that the Caldwell home was very well kept, but had an odd smell that reminded him of stagnant water and decay. He said that Margaret's problem seemed to have started after she started drinking from the lake, which her husband had told her not to do. The doctor said that her symptoms included strange changes in the color of her fingernails, unexplained bruises, and periods of clarity followed by delirium, during which she talked about faces in the water and the duty of the Caldwell blood. People said that the Caldwell kids, Elizabeth, 19, Robert, 17, Sarah, 14, and David, 10, were too pale and quiet. Dr. Harrington said that they moved around the house with mechanical precision and never spoke unless someone spoke to them directly. What bothered him the most was that they didn't seem to care about their mother's health. Elizabeth, in particular, watched the doctor's exam with what he called unsettling detachment, as if she were watching something that happened all the time, instead of her mother's decline. He said that all of the kids looked a lot like their father, with deep-set eyes and prominent cheekbones, but none of them seemed to have inherited Margaret's warmth or expressive features. Joseph Caldwell said that his wife had been having trouble with her mind for a while. He said that she drank from the lake because she was confused. Joseph got very upset when Dr. Harrington asked about the lake itself. He only said that it was not fit for consumption, and then quickly changed the subject. The doctor noticed that Joseph's hand shook a little when the lake was brought up, but his voice stayed steady. There was a brief but clear moment when Joseph and Elizabeth looked at each other in a way that suggested they understood each other without saying anything. Dr. Harrington took a sample of the lake water before he left, so he could look at it when he got back to town. His notes say that the water looked normal in a glass container, but it had a strange density and a faint metallic smell. He was going to send the sample to a co-worker at Washington University in St. Louis so they could look at it more closely. He also had a small journal in his medical bag where he had started to write down his thoughts about the Caldwell family. He noted that they showed signs of what he called environmental isolation syndrome, a condition he had seen in other remote homesteads where families had become too cut off from community and social interaction. Dr. Harrington's horse came back to town 2 days later, on April 9th, without him. The animal looked upset, and even though it was cool in the spring, its coat was covered in sweat. Sheriff James Holloway quickly put together a search party. They found the doctor's buggy turned over about a mile from the Caldwell property, at a bend in the road where Bluff Creek goes under a small wooden bridge. There were no signs of an accident or a fight on the buggy. It looked like someone had purposefully tipped it over. There was no sign of Dr. Harrington himself. His medical bag, journal, and the water sample were also gone. Sheriff Holloway went to the Caldwell home to tell them what was going on and ask if they had seen the doctor since his last visit. Joseph Caldwell said in an official report he filed on the 10th of April 1901 that he didn't know where Dr. Harrington was. Margaret Caldwell was now bedridden because her health had gotten much worse. The kids were still quiet and distant, just like Dr. Harrington had said. The sheriff said that the house felt unusually cold, even though there was a fire going in the fireplace. He also said that the strange smell the doctor had mentioned was now stronger, as if something from the lake had seeped into the walls of the house. Sheriff Holloway was most upset by Joseph Caldwell's refusal to let him get close to the lake, though. Joseph is said to have said, "That's private property." Joseph said, "There's nothing there that concerns you or anyone else in town." When asked about the lake's strange nature, he simply said, "Every Caldwell knows to respect the water. It's been in our family longer than you'd believe." The sheriff said that Joseph said this with a peculiar emphasis, as if he were giving a warning instead of just stating a fact. Joseph reacted right away and strongly when Sheriff Holloway suggested dragging the lake as part of the search for Dr. Harrington. He said, "No one touches the water. No one." The strength of his answer was enough to make the sheriff put off searching the lake itself for a while. Sheriff Holloway was interested in the Caldwell family's history when he got back to eminence because of this strange statement. County records show that Joseph Caldwell bought the land from Jeremiah Foster, one of the first people to settle in the area. Foster left suddenly in 1877 after his wife and 2 sons died for no apparent reason. Before the Fosters, a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller briefly claimed the land, but left after less than a year without giving a reason. A letter from the county clerk to his brother in Street. Louis said that Muller had run away after having strange things happen on the property, but the letter did not say what those things were. Sheriff Holloway was unable to locate any documentation of the lake itself. All official surveys of Shannon County say that there was no body of water at that spot. But he had seen it with his own eyes. A lake that was about 300 yards across and roughly circular. The surface was unnaturally still, even in the spring breeze. The water was so dark that it looked almost black in the middle, but it was clear enough near the edges to show smooth, pale stones on the bottom. It was strange that there were no visible inlets or outlets, which made me wonder how the lake stayed at the same level without becoming stagnant or drying up. The search for Dr. Harrington went on for almost 2 weeks, and it spread to the nearby forests and the banks of Jack's Fork River. Bloodhounds followed his scent to the edge of the Caldwell property, but when they were told to move forward, they whined and backed away. There was no sign of him, no clothes, no personal items, and no idea what might have happened to him. If it weren't for what happened next, his disappearance might have stayed just another unsolved mystery in the Ozarks. Margaret Caldwell passed away on the 23rd of April 1901. Joseph Caldwell didn't call the police to report her death because there was no doctor there. The next morning, Elizabeth, the oldest daughter, rode into town to tell Reverend Whitley. He said that she told him the news in a way that made him feel uneasy, saying only that her mother had returned to the water and that there would be no need for a funeral. The Reverend said that Elizabeth was wearing all black, which was not the usual mourning clothes of the time. Instead, she was wearing clothes that he said were antiquated, reminiscent of another century entirely. When the Reverend offered his condolences and help, Elizabeth just turned her horse around and left without saying another word, leaving him standing in the churchyard with questions he had not thought to ask. Reverend Whitley was worried about this strange behavior, so he talked to Sheriff Holloway, who agreed that an official visit to the Caldwell property was necessary. They left that same afternoon with 2 deputies, Michael Donovan, a new member of the small police force, and Frank Holloway, the sheriff's younger brother. Reverend Whitley later said that as they got closer to the Caldwell property, everyone in the group seemed to become more and more uneasy. The sounds of the forest birds singing and small animals moving through the underbrush slowly faded away until they were riding in complete silence. Even their horses got restless and needed constant reassurance. What they found at the Caldwell homestead is the main part of this disturbing case. It looked like no one lived in the house. Even though it was cool outside, there was no smoke coming from the chimney. There were no sounds coming from inside or outside the property. The front door was open and swinging a little in the wind. Deputy Donovan's report said that the door hinges, which should have creaked because the house is old, were completely quiet, as if they had just been oiled. The inside of the house was spotless, almost too clean. Everything was in its right place, and every surface had been cleaned. There was no sign of people living there, no unfinished work, no dishes that had just been used, and no beds that had been disturbed. It was as if the family had carefully gotten rid of all signs that they had been there before they left. Sheriff Holloway said that even though the place was clean, there was still a strange smell, like the bottom of a boat that has been too long in the water, as he put it in his report. Sheriff Holloway found Margaret Caldwell's clothes folded neatly on the bed in the master bedroom. There were all of her things there, which means she either left or was taken without any of her things. There was no evidence of her body. There were no signs of a burial or freshly dug graves on the property. Reverend Whitley looked more closely at the bed and saw that the sheets were wet, but nothing else in the room was. He said that the dampness felt cold to the touch and smelled like metal, which seemed to be everywhere on the property. The kids' rooms told a similar story. Their clothes were still there, and their few toys and personal items were still there. Reverend Whitley found a journal hidden under a loose floorboard in Elizabeth's room. This journal, which was kept in the Shannon County Records Office until it went missing in 1962, had entries that went back to when the family first came to Missouri. The first pages had been ripped out, which suggests that Elizabeth had purposely taken out information she didn't want to be found. The first few entries talked about a normal family life, even though they were alone. Elizabeth wrote about how she helped her mother with chores around the house, how her father worked to grow the little bit of arable land they had, and how her siblings played and fought. The lake was only mentioned in passing as the water, and it was said to be Father's true purpose for bringing us here. One entry from 1879, not long after they got there, said, "Father spent all day preparing the shoreline according to the old specifications. Robert and I helped move the stones into the pattern. Father says it must be exact, just as his father taught him." Mother watched from the porch, her face troubled. She still does not understand how important our duty is. The entries in the journal got worse and worse as time went on. Elizabeth wrote about how her father spent a lot of time by the lake, even at night. She said that he fed the water with small animals like chickens, rabbits, and sometimes a lamb. Elizabeth said that her father said this was necessary to maintain the balance. She wrote, "Father says the water needs regular tribute. When he does the offering right, the water gives back. The crops grow better than they should in this poor soil. The animals stay healthy despite the bad weather, and we, the Caldwell children, continue to thrive, while others in the area suffer from the usual childhood illnesses. The entries from the winter of 1900-1901 were the most upsetting. Elizabeth talked about how her mother was getting more and more worried about how her husband was acting. It seems that Margaret found out something about the lake's past that really upset her. Elizabeth wrote, "Today, Mother found Father's old family Bible. It had records going back to Pennsylvania. She got very upset about something she read there and confronted Father after dinner. I have never seen him so angry. He took the Bible and locked it away. Mother has been crying ever since." The next entry said, "Mother tried to take Sarah and David to town today. She said we were going to visit her sister in Springfield. Father stopped them at the edge of the property. I have never seen him use force against any of us before, but he dragged Mother from the wagon and ordered Robert to bring the younger ones back to the house. Mother has been locked in their bedroom since. Father says she is unwell and needs rest. He has asked me to prepare her meals and the special tea that comes from the flowers that grow only at the lake's edge." The last entry, from the 22nd of April 1901, said, "Mother drank from the water again today. Father says, it's time. We are all to prepare ourselves. The water must have what it needs." Sheriff Holloway and Reverend Whitley went on to search the rest of the property. There was no sign of the family in the barn or the other buildings. The family had left behind some animals, a few chickens, 2 cows, and a plow horse. They were all well fed and watered, which suggests that the family had made plans for their care even though they didn't plan to come back. Deputy Donovan found a small wooden chest in the barn loft that looked like it held family heirlooms. There was a pocket watch with strange engravings, a few pieces of jewelry that seemed too valuable for a family with little money, and a small glass vial with what looked like lake water in it. The cork was sealed with dark red wax. They didn't really understand what was going on until they got close to the lake. The lake looked almost exactly like Sheriff Holloway had said it would from his last visit. It was unnaturally still, and the water was so dark that it looked black. But now, at the edge of the water, they saw 5 sets of footprints going into the lake. The biggest set of footprints, which were probably Joseph's, led the way. 4 smaller sets of footprints, which were probably the children's, followed, with the smallest set at the end. Deputy Holloway's report said that the footprints in the mud were unusually clear, as if each step had been taken with a specific purpose and a lot of weight. None of the footprints came back from the water. Along the edge of the lake, they found a pattern of stones that were half buried in the ground. Reverend Whitley recognized these as old Celtic symbols that were used in water worship and sacrifice. The plants had hidden the arrangement, but it became clear when they looked more closely at the shoreline. The Reverend wrote in his journal that night that he was shocked to find pagan symbols in the heart of Christian America. He was also getting more and more worried about what the Caldwell family's relationship with the lake really was. Sheriff Holloway waded into the lake for a few feet, but then the bottom suddenly dropped out. The water was cold, colder than it should have been for late April, and it felt oily on his skin. He said he felt an unnatural current, as if something below was pulling gently but steadily. When he got back to shore, he saw that the water had left a dark stain on his boots and pants that was hard to get rid of. A more thorough search of the property found a cellar hidden under the barn. Sheriff Holloway found the family Bible that Elizabeth had talked about, as well as a bunch of papers from the early 1800s. These papers, which were put into evidence but later said to be missing from the county archives, seemed to have shown how the Caldwell family was connected to a similar body of water in western Pennsylvania. Reverend Whitley said that the documents made it seem like the Caldwells didn't just buy a property with a strange lake, they somehow brought the lake with them. The family papers often talked about relocating the water and keeping the covenant. The earliest documents, written by Joseph's grandfather, talked about finding water on their property in Pennsylvania in 1823, and how strange it was, and how it needed to be cared for. Joseph's grandfather wrote a letter to his son in 1842 that said, "The water has been with our family for 3 generations now. It provides prosperity in exchange for stewardship. Never forget that it must be moved every 3rd generation when it grows hungry for more than we can provide from the lesser creatures." The grimoire has exact instructions for how to move the water. Do exactly what it says, or the water will be angry. A letter from Joseph to his cousin in Pennsylvania, dated January 1901, was the most disturbing. He was worried that Margaret had learned too much about the water and might break the covenant that has sustained our family for generations. He wrote that if she couldn't be convinced to honor the old ways, certain necessary steps would have to be taken. The letter ended with a disturbing postscript. Elizabeth grows more adept in the rituals each day. She understands what must be done and has prepared her siblings accordingly. When the time comes, she will lead them as I have led them, and the covenant will remain unbroken. Also found in the cellar was a leather-bound book that Reverend Whitley called a Ledger of Offerings. It had dates going back to 1878 when the Caldwells first came to Missouri, and notes about what had been given to the water. Most of the entries were about animals, but some were very upsetting. An entry from 1880 said, "The Miller child," by accident, and added that the water was especially happy. The Millers were a family who lived far away and lost a young son to drowning in Jack's Fork River that year. The last entry, from the 23rd of April 1901, said only, "Margaret, willing in the end." The search for the Caldwell family, who went missing in 1901, went on all summer. Divers from Street, Louis were brought in to look at the lake, but they said it was surprisingly deep, over 100 feet at its center, and the bottom was made of a soft, shifting material that made it hard to keep your footing. One diver said they felt like something was watching them from the depths, but they never saw anything. One more refused to go down again, saying he had heard voices underwater speaking a language that sounded nothing like any other language. The diving trip was called off after one diver's airline seemed to be taken by something below, forcing an emergency ascent that almost killed him. Scientists looked at water samples and found a lot of minerals that aren't usually found in the area, as well as organic compounds that couldn't be identified using the scientific methods available at the time. Professor Edwin Laughlin from Washington University, who did the analysis, wrote that the water had properties more consistent with organic tissue than with any known form of naturally occurring water. He also said that when the water was left alone in a sealed container, it seemed to form a thin membrane on its surface that would fix itself if it broke. The Shannon County government turned down his requests for more samples so he could keep studying the lake. They had decided to keep the lake's strange properties a secret. The case was officially called an unsolved disappearance by September 1901, when no bodies had been found and there were no signs of the family anywhere else. Some people thought that the family killed Dr. Harrington and then killed themselves, while others thought that the family ran away after getting rid of his body. Not many people believed the more outlandish things that Elizabeth's journal and the family papers said. Sheriff Holloway's official report said that Joseph Caldwell probably killed his wife and Dr. Harrington, then ran away with his kids. The report only briefly mentioned the lake, calling it a natural feature of the property, with no bearing on the case. But Sheriff Holloway's private letters to the state authorities, which were found decades later in the Jefferson City archives, told a different story. He wrote to the Missouri Attorney General, "I cannot in good conscience close this case with the conventional explanation provided in my official report. What we found at the Caldwell property defies rational explanation. I believe the family did indeed enter the lake, as the evidence suggests, though what became of them thereafter I cannot say. More disturbing is my conviction that whatever dwells within that body of water remains there still, and that it poses a potential threat to anyone who approaches it unknowing of its nature." His recommendation that the state take over the property and drain or fill the lake was apparently ignored. The Caldwell property stayed empty, and the house was eventually taken back by the weather. People in the area stayed away because they said they could sometimes hear sounds coming from the lake at night that sounded neither human nor animal, but something in between. Parents told their kids to stay away from the Caldwell water, and hunters would go out of their way by several miles to avoid passing near it. The old Caldwell property saw something strange happen in 1937 during a very bad drought that affected a lot of the Ozarks. The lake, which had stayed at the same level for decades, started to go down. Things started to show up in the mud of the newly exposed shoreline as the water level went down. In October 1937, Arnold Fletcher, a local hunter who didn't believe in the property's superstitions, found these things. A field researcher from the Federal Writers Project was writing about Depression-era folklore in the area when he recorded his story. He said he found personal items that couldn't have been in that mud for less than 30 years, yet looked like they'd been dropped yesterday. Among these things was a doctor's bag that was worn but still usable. It had medical tools and a logbook that belonged to Dr. William Harrington. The last entry, which was written on the 9th of April 1901, talked about his second visit to the Caldwell property to check on Margaret's health. Mrs. Caldwell's condition has gotten a lot worse since my last visit. The symptoms point to poisoning rather than a natural illness. I took a sample of the tea Elizabeth has been giving her, as well as another water sample from the lake. There is something very wrong with this family and their relationship with that strange body of water. When I get back to town, I plan to contact the authorities in Jefferson City about. The entry ended mid-sentence. Older people in eminence also identified some jewelry as belonging to Margaret Caldwell, and a child's shoe that looked like the ones David Caldwell wore when he was a child. Fletcher's story said that these documents were genealogical records that traced the Caldwell family back to Scotland in the 1700s. They were sent to the University of Missouri for analysis, but were reportedly lost in transit in 1938. Fletcher said that he had looked at them before giving them to the police. He said that every generation of the family had an unusual pattern: children who became adults but had no record of their deaths, followed by the family moving to a new area. But the most important thing was a metal box with papers inside that seemed to have stayed dry even though they had been underwater for years. The first record was about an Angus Caldwell, which is how the name was spelled in Scotland at the time. He is said to have found a strange spring on his property in the Highlands in 1782. People said the spring had amazing qualities, like water that never froze and seemed to bring the family good health and wealth. The records showed that Angus and his whole family went missing in 1804, and a cousin got the property. 2 years later, that same cousin showed up in Virginia records again, having built a new home near a small lake that had not been seen on previous surveys of the area. Fletcher also said he found what looked like a journal written by Joseph Caldwell himself, but most of it was hard to read because it had been damaged by water. Some parts were still easy to read. One passage said, "The water requires Caldwell blood to maintain its properties. This has been our burden and our blessing since Angus first discovered it in the old country. Each generation must pay the price to preserve what sustains us," another passage said. Margaret refuses to accept our heritage. She does not understand that what the water gives, it must eventually take back. The children have been prepared since birth for their duty. Elizabeth especially comprehends the necessity of our covenant. The most disturbing entry described the ritual by which the lake could supposedly be relocated. When the time comes to move the water, a vessel of the correct dimensions must be filled from the deepest part of the lake. This vessel, properly sealed with the wax of bees that have fed on flowers growing at the water's edge, contains the essence of the water. Where this essence is poured, the water will follow, drawn across any distance to reform in its new home. The ritual must be performed under the dark of the moon, and the new location must be prepared with the appropriate symbols and offerings. People mostly thought Fletcher's story was just superstition and exaggeration, especially since the main evidence went missing at just the right time. The drought ended in late 1937, and the lake rose back to its old level, hiding any other secrets that might have been found in its depths. If it weren't for what happened in 1952, when a University of Missouri graduate student named Richard Carter started looking into disappearances in the Ozarks for his PhD dissertation, the case might have been forgotten. Carter found the original sheriff's reports about the Caldwell case and was interested in the strange and inconsistent things he saw. Carter found records of similar disappearances in western Pennsylvania in the 1,870 seconds while he was doing his research. Before the Caldwells moved to Missouri, a family with the same name lived near a small, unnamed lake outside of Pittsburgh. In 1877, the whole Caldwell family disappeared after a local doctor who had been treating Mrs. Caldwell went missing for no clear reason. Their land was sold to distant relatives, who quickly filled in what was called a stagnant pond on the property. The new owners said they had strange problems with the filled-in area, such as the ground staying muddy no matter how hard they tried to drain it, and strange noises that seemed to come from below the ground. Carter's research took him to similar cases in Virginia, in the 1,820 seconds, and, most interestingly, to a remote part of Scotland in the 1,780 seconds. In every case, a family with the last name Caldwell, or its Scottish version, Caldwell, lived near a strange body of water. In every case, the same thing happened. The wife got sick, a local healer or doctor went missing while treating her, and then the whole family disappeared without a trace. After that, there were reports of strange things happening around the body of water in each place, like strange sounds, strange effects on nearby plants and animals, and a long-standing belief in the area that the water was somehow alive or aware. Carter's unpublished manuscript, The Water Keepers, Generational Disappearances in American Rural Communities, put forth a theory that the Caldwell family was participating in cult-like behavior, possibly involving water tainted with hallucinogenic substances that caused shared psychosis. He proposed that each generation culminated in ritual suicide, with a segment of the family perpetuating the tradition in another location. This theory, although more plausible than supernatural explanations, did not adequately address the consistent reports regarding the water's unusual properties or the apparent relocation of the lake across generations. Carter's academic advisors turned down his manuscript because they thought it was too speculative and sensational. Dr. Lawrence Winters, the chair of Mr. and Vive, Carter's thesis committee, wrote in his evaluation, "While Mr. Carter's research is thorough, his conclusions venture too far into the realm of folklore and superstition to be considered serious academic work. His insistence on connecting these disparate cases based on superficial similarities and local legends does not meet the standard of evidence required for doctrinal research." He gave up on his academic career because he was discouraged, but he kept looking into things on his own. He went to the old Caldwell property in Shannon County in 1958. By then, it had become part of the Mark Twain National Forest. Carter used the original sheriff's reports and survey maps from 1901 to find the lake, which was still there even though it wasn't on any official forest maps. The fact that Richard Carter is still missing is one of the most disturbing parts of the Caldwell case. Carter had set up camp near the lake and had been there for about 3 days when forest rangers found his abandoned car. His tent had his research materials, like notebooks, where he wrote down what he saw at the lake. The notes said that the water moved in a way that was not caused by wind or other outside factors, and that vocalizations came from the center of the lake before dawn. The last thing Carter wrote in his notebook was on the 17th of June, 1958. "The water moved today not from wind or rain. There has been neither. It moved as if something large were disturbing it from beneath. I'm setting up my camera tonight to see if I can capture whatever emerges after dark. I've placed markers at the water's edge to measure any changes in level. The most peculiar development is that I've begun to dream of the Caldwells. In these dreams, they walk beneath the surface of the lake. Their eyes open, their movements graceful and unimpeded by the water. They seem to be trying to communicate something of great urgency. Tonight, I intend to listen." They never found Carter himself. His camera, which was found on the edge of the lake, had film that had been wet, so any pictures it might have taken were lost. Some of his markers had been moved, and some were even missing. Some were found floating in the middle of the lake. The most confusing thing was finding a sealed glass vial half buried at the edge of the water that looked like lake water and had the words, "For analysis." "Exhibits unusual properties" written on it in Carter's handwriting. The ranger station logged this vial as evidence, but it was reported missing the next day. After Carter went missing, the Forest Service closed off that part of the National Forest because of safety concerns and environmental issues. A geological survey done in 1959 said that the lake looked like a sinkhole that could collapse, putting visitors in danger. This explanation was officially accepted, and signs were put up all around the area to warn people. But internal Forest Service documents that were made public in 1987 but mostly ignored tell a different story. The survey team found a number of strange things that couldn't be explained by normal geological processes. There was no clear source or outlet for the lake, but its level stayed the same even when it rained or dried out. Water samples showed compounds that couldn't be identified with current analytical methods and acted strangely when exposed to electrical current. The water reacted slightly but measurably to being close to human blood, which the report called apparent attraction or affinity. The report's most important finding was that there were no fish or amphibians in the lake and that insects stayed away from its surface. It was rare to see birds flying directly over the water. The plants around it were plentiful, but they were said to be morphologically typical but have small biochemical differences from the same species in other parts of the forest. Plants that were growing within 20 yards of the shore had chemicals that weren't found in the same species growing in other places. Preliminary analysis suggested that these chemicals might have pharmaceutical potential. The survey team's last suggestion was to permanently limit access to the area and fill in the lake with dirt and concrete. It seems that higher-ups decided against this suggestion, but the reasons are not clear in the documents we have. Instead, the lake was taken off of official maps, and the area was turned into a research preserve where only authorized people could go. Dr. Alan Pritchard, one of the people who worked on the survey, was still interested in the lake after the official investigation was over. His personal papers, which he gave to the Missouri Historical Society after he died in 1981, included a set of photos of the lake taken between 1959 and 1964. When you put these pictures in order by date, they seem to show small but clear changes in the lake's shape and position. Dr. Pritchard's notes say that the lake was slowly moving, getting bigger in one direction and smaller in the other at a rate of about 1 inch per year. His last entry, from November 1964, says, "I am now convinced that what we are seeing is not a lake in the usual sense, but something else entirely. Something that only looks like a natural body of water. Its true nature and purpose remain unclear, but I can't help but think that it has some kind of awareness. I have sent my findings to the Department of the Interior, but I don't expect them to take them seriously." The last official investigation of the Caldwell case in the lake happened in 1968 when journalist Eleanor Reynolds looked into the story for a series on unsolved mysteries in the Ozarks. Reynolds was able to look at what was left of the original case files and talk to a few older people in eminence who still remembered the Caldwell family and how they had disappeared. One very important interview was with Martha Holloway, the 91-year-old widow of Deputy Frank Holloway. She went with her brother-in-law, Sheriff James Holloway, to the Caldwell property in 1901. Reynolds's notes say that Martha remembered her husband's description of the scene very clearly. "Frank was never the same after that day," she is said to have said. "He wouldn't talk about most of what they found, but he did tell me one thing that stayed with me all these years." He said, when they were standing at the edge of that lake looking at those footprints going into the water, they all heard a child's laugh coming from somewhere beneath the surface. Sheriff Holloway wrote in his report that it was just a bird or some animal in the woods, but Frank knew better. He said it was David Caldwell's laugh, just as clear as if the boy were standing right next to them. And then, just for a moment, Frank swore he saw faces looking up at them from deep in the water, all 5 of the Caldwells, staring up with eyes wide open, like they were alive down there, watching. Martha Holloway also said that her husband took something from the Caldwell house that day that he never gave to the police as evidence. Joseph Caldwell had been studying a small glass vial of water from the lake. Frank Holloway kept this vial locked in a small box in their attic until he died in 1942. That water never evaporated. Martha told Reynolds, "Not in all those years. And sometimes, when the light hit it just right, Frank said he could see tiny movements inside, like something was living in there. The night before he died, he made me promise to pour it back into the lake. I did it the very next day, though it was the hardest journey I ever made, going back to that awful place." Martha went on to say that in the weeks after they visited the Caldwell property, her husband started having vivid dreams about the lake. He'd wake up in the middle of the night talking about the water calling to him, Martha said. He said he could hear Joseph Caldwell's voice in his head, telling him terrible things about what the water wanted and what it could do. These dreams went on for months until Frank finally moved the vial from their bedroom to the attic. Even then, he said he could feel it up there, waiting. That's why he never got rid of it all those years. He was afraid of what would happen if that water got too far away from the rest of itself. Reynolds also talked to Thomas Jenkins, who was a young boy living in Eminence when the Caldwell family went missing. Jenkins said that his father, who had been looking for Dr. Harrington, told him about seeing strange markings carved into trees around the Caldwell property. He said they weren't like any symbols he'd ever seen before. They weren't letters or pictures exactly, but something in between, and they all seemed to be pointing toward the lake, like trail markers. Jenkins said his father had written down some of these symbols in a notebook, but burned it after having bad dreams that he thought were caused by the markings. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a 3-part series in September 1968 that was the result of Reynolds' investigation. The articles told the story of the case without going into the more sensational details. Instead, they focused on the historical mystery and the idea that the Caldwells may have been murdered, possibly by Joseph himself, who may have then killed himself and his children. The editors of the newspaper had insisted on a logical approach, stressing the chances of normal explanations over the supernatural ones that some of Reynolds' sources had suggested. Reynolds' published articles didn't include her own experiences at the lake, but her research notes from after her death in 1981 did. Reynolds went to the site 3 times while she was looking into it, according to these private notes. She didn't see anything strange on her first 2 visits, other than how beautiful and still the lake was. On her final visit, however, she wrote, "I stood at the edge of the water as the sun was setting, trying to imagine the scene as Sheriff Holloway and his men must have seen it that day in 1901. The lake was as still as glass, despite the evening breeze that rustled the trees around me. And then, just for a moment, I saw what appeared to be ripples forming in the center, moving outward in a perfect circle, as if something had surfaced briefly and then submerged again. As I watched, fascinated, I became aware of a sound just at the threshold of hearing, voices murmuring, too faint to make out words. I convinced myself it was just the wind in the trees, or my own imagination, influenced by the stories I'd been immersing myself in for weeks. But then I saw them, 5 pale figures standing on the opposite shore, watching me. A man, a woman, and 3 children of descending heights. They were too distant to make out their features clearly, but they appeared to be wearing clothing from another era. I raised my hand, unsure if I was greeting them or warning them away. As one, they turned and walked into the lake, disappearing beneath the surface without creating so much as a ripple. I have never run so fast in my life. I will not be returning to that place again, nor will I include this experience in my article. Some stories are better left untold. Reynolds' notes also said that she found a small stone at the edge of the lake. It was unusual because it was perfectly round and made of a material she couldn't identify, something in between stone and metal. She took this object with her, but it disappeared from her hotel room that night. Instead, she found a small puddle of water on the nightstand that had somehow turned into the shape of a handprint. After her articles came out, Reynolds got a lot of letters from readers saying they had had strange experiences with bodies of water, mostly in the Appalachian and Ozark regions. She collected these stories, but never published them. They were about lakes or ponds that were like Caldwell Lake, in that they had strange colors, water levels that changed for no reason, strange effects on nearby animals, and, in some cases, strange effects on the dreams and thoughts of people who spent time near them. A correspondent, who only said he used to work for the U.S. Geological Survey, said that there might be a scientific reason for these kinds of things to happen. He thought that some underground mineral formations could make localized electromagnetic fields that changed the chemistry of water and the way the brain works in humans, which could have led to hallucinations or changes in perception. He said that the government had looked into a number of these places but had kept the results secret for reasons he didn't explain. The lake is still hidden deep in the Mark Twain National Forest. Maps from the government show nothing but woods that go on and on. The Forest Service says that there is no significant body of water at those coordinates, even though satellite images show otherwise. When asked about this difference, officials usually say it's because of mistakes in the maps or ponds that form in the spring after a lot of rain. People who have worked in the area for a long time, on the other hand, tell a different story. James Wilson worked as a forest ranger in the Mark Twain National Forest from 1972 to 1993. In 2001, he talked to a local historian on the condition that he not be named. Wilson said that some parts of the forest were off-limits to regular ranger patrols and could only be accessed by certain people from outside agencies. "We were told it was for scientific research, but no one ever saw any scientists come or go," Wilson said. There was one area in particular, about 7 miles northeast of Eminence, that was especially restricted. "We had standing orders to redirect any hikers or campers who wandered too close, citing hazardous terrain or wildlife management zones." Wilson also said that at least 3 people went missing near this restricted area while he was in charge. In each case, the official reason for the disappearances was that hikers had gone off the marked trails or had run into wildlife. But the searches were unusually short and mostly done by federal agents instead of local authorities. Wilson said, "They'd come in, do what looked like a quick search, and then say the person was lost to exposure or an animal attack, even if they didn't find any remains." What always struck me as strange was how quickly these cases were closed and how little information was shared with us who worked in the forest every day. Hikers sometimes say they find a lake that is unusually still and dark where there shouldn't be one. People who stop to rest by the lake's edge sometimes say they hear voices on the wind or see things moving under the water that look like people walking along the bottom of the lake as if it were solid ground. The most disturbing stories are from people who said they took pictures of the lake, but when they developed or looked at the pictures later, they saw not water, but what looked like a family, a man, a woman, and 3 children standing where the lake should be, their faces serious and their eyes fixed on the camera. Reports say that in 1996, an unnamed federal agency combined all the records related to the Caldwell case and put them under national security protocols. The reason given was potential environmental contaminants of unknown origin and effect. Requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act have been consistently denied, and the government has not confirmed or denied the existence of such records. People are guessing about what the lake really is and how it might be important to national interests because of the strange level of secrecy around what should be a 100-year-old local mystery. Dr. Meredith Lane, a hydrologist who tried to find and study the lake in the early 1992 as part of her research on unusual water bodies, said that Forest Service officials wouldn't let her into the area. In a 1995 interview with a scientific journal, she said, "There's clearly something in that part of the forest that the authorities don't want examined. When I presented my credentials and research proposal, I was told in no uncertain terms that the area was restricted due to ongoing government research. When I pressed for details about this research or the possibility of collaboration, the conversation was terminated, and I was escorted from the property." Dr. Helen Morrison, a hydrogeologist with the U.S., was the last known person to officially visit the lake. Geological Survey, which did a quick check in 1965 as part of a study of the water table in the area. Her report said that the lake was a geological oddity that needed more study, but no such study was ever approved. The report said that the lake had some strange features, such as the fact that it seemed to be cut off from the regional water table and the fact that its water had an unusual chemical makeup, with organic compounds that are not usually found in natural freshwater systems. Dr. Morrison wrote to a colleague in a private letter that was found among her things after she retired in 1982. "What we found in the Ozarks defies conventional explanation. The water itself seems to have properties that violate known physical laws. It behaves almost as if it were sentient, responding to stimuli in ways that water simply should not. I've requested further research funds, but my superiors seem determined to bury this discovery. Sometimes I wonder if they know more about that place than they're willing to admit." In another letter from 1966, she said she was getting more and more frustrated. "They've turned down my follow-up proposal and put me on the Dakota Aquifer study. When I tried to get my own samples and data from the Ozark site, I was told they had been moved to a special facility, No one will tell me where this facility is or who is continuing the research. It's as if they want to pretend that lake doesn't exist while they study it in secret. The most troubling thing was her last mention of the lake in a personal journal entry from 1979. I dreamed of the Caldwell Lake again last night. It's been 14 years since I was there, but in my dreams I return almost monthly. The dreams are always the same. I'm standing at the edge of the water, and faces appear just beneath the surface. They speak to me explaining something of great importance, but when I wake, I can never remember what they said. Only the sense of urgency remains, and the feeling that the water is trying to reach beyond its boundaries. I've begun to wonder if everyone who has direct contact with that water carries a piece of it within them, a connection that never truly breaks. The Caldwell family and their macabre lake have become famous in the Ozarks. Parents tell their kids not to go near bodies of water in the woods that they don't know. Campers stay away from putting up their tents near dark, still pools. And sometimes, people who have lived in Shannon County for a long time say they see a pale family of 5 walking along the road toward Eminence just before sunset. The family consists of a man, a woman, and 3 children. Their clothes are dry even though they look like they just came out of the water, and their eyes reflect the dying light in a way that doesn't seem quite human. People who say they saw this ghostly family say that they felt a strong sense of sadness and urgency coming from them, as if they were trying to say something very important. The family never talks or even looks at the people who see them in any of the stories. They just walk with purpose toward town, and before they get to the first buildings, they disappear from view. People in the area believe that these ghosts only show up when there is a drought and the lake level drops below a certain point. In 2002, during a bad drought that hit most of Missouri, Ranger Daniel Collins said he saw strange footprints on a trail that wasn't used very often. The trail was about 6 miles from where Caldwell Lake was thought to be. The footprints looked like they belonged to a family group of 2 adults and 3 children, but they had an unusual feature. They were wet, as if the people had just come out of the water. Even though the nearest known water source was several miles away, Collins followed the tracks for almost a mile, but then they just stopped in the middle of the path. His report was filed, but it seems that no one looked into it further. That summer, a lot of people in Eminence said they had strange dreams about a family that looked like the Caldwells. In every case, the people who dreamed about the family said they were standing at the edge of a dark body of water and waving their arms as if they were trying to warn them of something. 87-year-old Dorothy Whitley, who is a distant relative of Reverend Thomas Whitley, said that, in her dream, the youngest child said, "The water is moving again." 2 weeks later, a small earthquake happened in the area, which is unusual for the Ozarks, where there isn't much seismic activity. What we don't know about this case is probably the most disturbing part. There are classified documents, missing evidence, and a lake that officially doesn't exist that are still hiding things. What promise did the Caldwell family keep for many years? What was the final cost for them? And what, if anything, is still in those waters, waiting for the next person who is curious to get too close to the shore? Most scientists don't take the Caldwell case seriously because they think it's a mix of local superstition, exaggerated stories, and maybe a few real but explainable strange things. Skeptics point to the fact that there is no proof, that important documents have gone missing, and that these kinds of stories tend to get more complicated with each telling. They think that the Caldwell family probably had a more normal end, like murder or suicide, or just moving without telling anyone in the area. They also think that the lake itself, if it even exists, is just a boring pond that has been made to look much more interesting over time. People who have looked into the case more closely, on the other hand, point out that some details are the same in many different accounts from different people over many years. It's hard to completely ignore the lake's strange looks and behavior, the strange effects it seems to have on people who come into contact with it, and the fact that people keep going missing around it. Some scientists who study strange events think that Caldwell Lake might be a real mystery that needs to be looked into scientifically, but only if getting to the site and the records that are needed weren't so hard. Dr. Lawrence Weber, a geologist who has studied strange water formations all over North America, wrote in an academic paper in 2005 that some bodies of water might gain special qualities because of rare combinations of minerals, bacteria, and geological conditions. He thought that, in certain situations, a lake could create a complex ecosystem that was so different from what is normal that it might seem to act in ways that observers would think were conscious or purposeful. Even though he didn't directly talk about the Caldwell case, the way he talked about these hypothetical bodies of water is very similar to how people talked about the Missouri Lake. Weber wrote that in these rare cases, the water itself becomes a kind of superorganism, with properties and behaviors that go beyond what we usually think of as inanimate matter. The lines between living and non-living become less clear in these systems, which could lead to events that our current scientific framework can't fully explain or categorize. Emma Richardson, a local historian who has been collecting oral histories from the Ozarks for more than 30 years, gives us a view that connects folklore and fact. She says that stories like the Caldwell Lake last because they have some truth in them, even though they have been changed over time and told again. Something strange happened to that family, and something strange is going on in that part of the forest. Whether the water itself is supernatural or just the focus of superstitions built around tragic but natural events, the fact remains that people keep having experiences there that they can't explain. Experiences that are consistent enough in their details to suggest a common cause rather than just imagination. If you want to find out for yourself, be careful. The coordinates that would take you to Caldwell Lake have been systematically taken out of all public records. People who say they found it by accident don't often say where it is, as if some instinct tells them not to give away its location. Maybe this is wise. It's best to leave some mysteries alone, just like some waters. The most recent sighting of what could be the Caldwell Lake happened in 2017 when a group of hikers got lost in the Mark Twain National Forest on an unusually warm October weekend. They wrote about their experience on an anonymous online forum for hikers. They said that they found a small, perfectly round lake in a clearing that wasn't on their maps. They said the water was too still and dark for a body of water. It looked more like a hole in the ground. The hikers said they felt an immediate and overwhelming sense of unease when they found the lake. One person in the group even got sick. They said they saw ripples forming in the middle of the lake as they were getting ready to leave. The ripples moved in a spiral pattern that couldn't have been caused by wind or anything else natural. What was most disturbing was that they all said they felt like they were being watched as they hurried away, not from the forest around them, but from the water itself. We don't know if this was really Caldwell Lake or just another pond in the big forest that wasn't marked. The hikers purposely left out the exact location in their post, saying only that it was several miles off any marked trail and that they didn't want to try to find it again. Their last comment may sum up the mystery of Caldwell Lake best. Whatever is there, it feels ancient and patient, like something that has existed for centuries and will continue to exist long after we're gone. It doesn't feel malevolent exactly, but it doesn't feel natural either. It feels like something that doesn't belong in our world, but has found a way to exist here anyway, hidden in plain sight. The Shannon County Historical Society has one photo that might show the Caldwell family. It was taken in 1879 and is labeled New Residence. It shows a man with a serious face and deep-set eyes standing behind a woman sitting in a chair. 4 kids of different ages stand on either side, and they all look serious. It's not just the family's looks that make the picture interesting. It's also what's in the background. A dark shape that could be water, with what looks like a ripple or disturbance on its surface, which makes the picture look like it was moving when it should have been still. We may never know the whole truth about the Caldwell family and their strange lake. Maybe this is on purpose. Not just because time has passed and records have been lost, but also because facts that are too disturbing or hard to explain are being kept out of official history. What is left are the pieces, the footprints that lead into the water but never come out, the strange artifacts that appeared during times of drought, the steady reports of strange events that have been going on for more than a century, and the persistent rumors that the government is interested in what should be, by all reasonable standards, nothing more than a forgotten local mystery. In the end, the story of the macabre lake of the Caldwell family reminds us that there may be things that move in the depths, patient and ancient, waiting to be discovered by those who go beyond what is known. These things may not fit into our ordered, explainable world. The lake's legend lives on, like a dark ripple in the otherwise calm surface of history. It could be a natural anomaly, a place where tragic human events have been exaggerated over time and in the imagination, or something that is truly beyond our current understanding.